U2 are the band who have it all. They have the sales, they have the kudos, and they have the questing spirit.
I thought your eyes are wide and though your soul, it can't be bought, your mind can wander. Hello, not a place called Vertigo.
A name is synonymous with that kind of stature is a pretty incredible achievement.
That epic sound, which just works in big spaces. It just does. It's not intimate.
U2 began life as a school band at Dublin's Mount Temple Comprehensive when drummer Larry Mullen placed an advertisement for like-minded musicians on the school notice board.
4 of them met. They decided that they had some kind of vague common interest in music.
They were all individually really inspired by the punk bands that had emerged, as any kids of their age would have been around the end of the 70s.
They eventually formed bands such as Feedback, who played covers of Peter Frampton and the Bay City Rollers. They eventually solidified themselves and became the Hype.
A family friend of bassist Adam Clayton suggested the name U2, which the band liked for its ambiguity. They took the new name to a talent contest in Limerick.
They were the only band to play original material, and they won their £500 and the day in the studio. And of course, this really was where it all began.
They record the demo and it goes well. They end up getting a manager through it, and I think this kind of meeting with the manager really cemented them as a band. They go from being a little school kind of group to becoming a proper band.
The band released an EP through Irish label CBS, who were impressed by their demo. Manager Paul McGuinness helped them negotiate a deal with Island Records, and they entered the studio with Steve Lillywhite to produce their debut album.
He was the man who said, look, we can do it, and we can create this brilliant atmosphere. And you can hear his influence in the very, very early days of U2.
Working with Lillywhite, the band produced their first 2 albums, Boy and October. Although they weren't instant successes, U2 were developing their sound and making their intentions clear.
So before, with Led Zeppelin or whatever, when you're talking about stadium rock bands, the thing that kind of filled the rafters were either sort of these big guitar solos or a kind of Who-style power, Pete Townsend-style power riff. Big sound blasting out of a Marshall stack. U2 came up with this new thing, which was this kind of this reverberating sound, which is almost like a kind of church-like sound, I suppose, which makes sense given their Christian background. I mean, I don't know if it's fair to draw an analogy between the two, but it was definitely a kind of cathedral of sound, to use a terrible rock critic's cliche.
The recording of October was incredibly traumatic, partially because the religious 3 of U2, i.e. everybody except Adam, had joined this, shall we say, cult called the Shalom Fellowship. And this was a very, very militant Christian organisation. Bono and Edge both left the band briefly because they couldn't reconcile their spiritual beliefs with the mostly secular music that they were making. And in the event, they had a tour arranged for October, and both Edge and Bono wanted to pull out of this until U2's manager, Paul McGuinness, pointed out that the tour was booked and that an awful lot of people were depending on U2 for their livelihoods.
And that was very much sort of drawing them along right from the beginning, and it wasn't just about being a rock and roll star, it was also about following the right path.
All is quiet on New Year's Day. A world in wild is underway.
In In 1983, the commercial fortune of the band changed with the release of War. The Edge used less delay and echo on his guitar, and Lillywhite encouraged Larry to simplify his drumming. The result was a harsher, more direct sound.
They were the only ones making this kind of music at that time, that kind of rock sound that would kind of conquer the mainstream. And I think, yeah, it was a success well deserved.
Boy, you know, the U2's first album, it had this very innocent looking boy on the cover. War had the same boy on the cover, frowning, and it's a very, very powerful image. It's basically saying, you know, innocence gone.
It finds a focusing of Bono's lyric writing, which I think previously had been quite adolescent-y, quite angsty, quite internal. However, with War, he kind of steps up and sort of surveys the landscape. And you've still got to remember that there's a lot of trouble in Northern Ireland. He decides that this is his thing. You know, let's deal with this. Let's address this.
Sunday Bloody Sunday, of course. I mean, that really announced U2 as this band which actually, you know, which drew attention to this horrific event in Irish history. And that changed things. You know, all of a sudden it was okay, we need to take this band seriously.
We remember that U2 came from a punk, you know, they were massively into the Clash. And bands who made political statements. It was kind of natural for them to be making the, you know, big political statements.
It's not taking sides, it's kind of just saying how long do we have to deal with this, everybody, and it kind of unites people as well as describing, you know, a kind of terrible, terrible situation.
War took the band to the global market, going gold in the US as well as topping the UK charts. However, they feared becoming just another stadium rock band and looked to a more experimental producer for their next album. Island Records founder Chris Blackwell was initially sceptical.
Chris Blackwell didn't really want U2 to recruit Brian Eno. Partially because he'd heard that Eno was doing a bird album, i.e. a song where each track would be titled about individual birds and sound like the same. And he didn't really want any of that on U2 records.
Brian Eno had obviously come from Roxy Music, where he was making noises with electronics, and then he'd then become an ambient musician in his own right. He'd done the Here Come the Warm Jets album, and albums like Another Green World. So he was a pretty out there character.
Eno and Daniel Lanois are both important in expanding the sound of U2. They bring texture to it. They bring a kind of an ambient texture to it. But you know, Lanois always, for good or ill, you know, very good at listen to, you know, Oh Mercy, which he did with Dylan, and the way that he brought a kind of space to that album. He does that with U2. There's space which is filled with Eno's ambience. I suppose that's how I'd kind of rather crassly divide it between them.
U2 developed their live set to accommodate the layers of production that featured on the album, culminating with a memorable performance at Live Aid in 1985. The band were keen to stay on with Brian Eno and Daniel Lanois as they began work on the Joshua Tree.
I want to hide. I wanna tear down the walls and hold me inside. I wanna reach out and touch the flame where the streets are running.
U2 had fallen in love with America, particularly American culture, and in the case of Bono, a lot of the outlaw American writers such as Bukowski. And America, to its credit, had also returned the love. It wasn't an unrequited love.
You know, they coined the sort of the epic sound of the you know, the Great West, and they pulled in these Celtic roots music, but combined it with American roots music.
Where the streets have no name, where the streets have no name, we're still building them, burning down low.
But it's kind of dealing with the failures of the American dream in a way. It's kind of attacking the kind of mythology that's around. Well, not attacking, but it's kind of examining the mythology that makes America.
They brought in all their own staff to record it, and the control room was called like the lyric room and all this kind of Brian Eno-y type stuff. But also, a lot of that record is actually, rather than overlaying stuff over each other's parts individually as they've done before, a lot of that record, for a big production album, is all cut together in the room as a live band. And that's one of the things that gives it its character.
I have climbed highest mountains, I have run through the fields, only to be with you.
I still haven't found what I'm looking for. Is probably still the standout track, because U2 was so big at the time and so huge, yet they had doubts. And obviously from the title, but also the whole lyric of I Still Haven't Found What I'm Looking For is packed with doubts. And bands of this scale don't admit to having doubts.
The Joshua Tree, it's a band at the peak of their powers, doing things not short of inspiration or songs, and very, very sure and confident about what they want to be, which is to be as big as Led Zeppelin.
Lover, I'm on the street, gonna go where the bright lights and the big city meet. Keep the red guitar on fire. Desire.
The Joshua Tree stayed at the top of the US charts for 9 weeks. Caught up in its success, a documentary and album, Rattle and Hum, were quickly produced. The album featured US legends Bob Dylan and B.B. King, but the band came under fire for the release.
By this point, it started getting a little bit pompous, and the thing is, you know, with someone like B.B. King, who's a great blues legend and one of the pioneers who happened to be, you know, happened to still be one of the few blues pioneers who are still alive. Bob Dylan, of course, you know, just Bob Dylan. I just felt that they were being subsumed into this beast, and the beast wasn't as expressive or as interesting as those people were.
To me, they felt musically stagnant at this point. In a sense, how do you follow the Joshua Tree? Just get some big names in. I didn't think they gave it enough time. I didn't think they worked on it for long enough.
It's a big album in their narrative, in terms of by taking the tropes and sounds and the iconography of American music and kind of feeding it back to American audiences. You know, it's a great trick.
Feeling the critical backlash, the band relocated to Berlin. The city's music scene was developing as the 80s began, and Berlin's industrial and electronic dance movement was something that Bono and The Edge were keen to capture. Clayton and Mullen were eventually convinced when the band brought it together to create their 7th album, Acton Baby.
Darling, take a walk with your sister the moon. Get a pale light to fill up your room. You've been living underground, eating from a can. You've been running away from what you don't understand.
When a band released a record like The Unforgettable Fire, and then an album like Joshua Tree, and they're at that stage where it becomes a huge brand. And to make an album that adventurous and that different is just, you've got to commend them for that. And the rhythms, the kind of krautrock inspired rhythms, and all the weird distant keyboard sounds on it. And it's a very, very, very adventurous album for the biggest band in the world to be making at that point.
Bono in particular has always wanted to push U2 forwards. At this period, he had a particular thing about jettisoning the past, not rejecting it, not pretending it never happened, but just moving on so that U2 wouldn't sound like U2. They sounded like a better version of U2.
To promote the release, the band created the elaborate Zoo TV tour, which broke with their traditional live setup and aimed to be completely immersive.
It's alright, it's alright, alright. She moves in mysterious ways.
I saw the Zoo TV tour several times, and it was one of the, possibly the best stadium show I've ever seen.
I think they had things like walls of banks of televisions and all this kind of stuff. And at one point, I think he had a link up to Sarajevo in the middle of a war.
Bono kind of played different characters on stage. They were really throwing everything into their live performance at this point.
I know it sounds a terrible cliche, but they played stadiums and they made it feel intimate, but also they made it feel fun. I mean, stadium gigs, as we must be honest, are not always fun. This was a great experience. It showed that you could do stadium gigs differently.
The band took another dramatic change in style with the album Pop. Choosing new producers, they worked to create a new sound built on loops and sequencing.
It was a very brave album, but brave albums don't necessarily make for great listening. And whereas with Acting Baby, they'd been ahead of everybody, suddenly, by recruiting producers and collaborators such as Nelly Hooper and Howard B, who were very much flavours of the moment, they started to sound behind the times.
I think, by the time Pop came out, the press were out to get U2. I mean, they were just so huge at that time, and when a band has been huge for that long, they invariably represent the status quo.
I didn't like Pop as much. I feel like they focused too much on the way things sounded and actually less kind of on the songs, and I think that's what people love about U2, is connecting with those songs, and the emotional element was missing for me.
Although Pop charted at #1 in many countries, it didn't match the band's previous enormous success. But in 2000, they reunited with Eno and Lanois for their next album, All That You Can't Leave Behind. Bono declared that U2 was reapplying for the job of the best band in the world.
All That You Can't Leave Behind, it just sounds like a U2 album. It's unashamedly so. Like that's its strength.
It did feel a little bit like they were going back in terms of going back to their roots and what we kind of know about U2, which is essentially an emotional kind of rock band who can write great big anthems that everyone wants to sing along to. I think it's a great record.
Well, when they did Beautiful Day, I mean, that does sound like a U2 song, doesn't it? It really does. You know, it sounds like it's a proper kind of festival anthem.
It's a beautiful day. Don't let it get away. It's a beautiful day.
Beautiful Day is built on a guitar sound that the Edges kind of previously used, and in a sense I don't blame him for that. It's kind of like, if you've made that guitar sound, it's yours and you can kind of use it as much as you want.
Edge's response was, this is how I play the guitar. And if you listen, I'm going to do it really, really well. And he did.
The album was a return to commercial form, selling 12 million copies worldwide. For their eagerly awaited follow-up record, Bono looked at the bands that inspired him during U2's early years, and in turn brought back their first producer, Steve Lillywhite, for 2004's How to Dismantle an Atomic Bomb.
How to Dismantle an Atomic Bomb was described by Bono as kind of their first rock album. I mean, I would argue with that. I think they've been making quite a few rock records before that, but definitely is their kind of most attacking record sonically. It's harder.
Give me something I can
At that point, U2 were probably what is roughly and perhaps pejoratively called a heritage act, in the sense that they really are the kind of band that you go and see live. I mean, I remember seeing them at Glastonbury not very long ago, and and you thought, well, whether you like this band or not, they can really do this. They can really headline Glastonbury.
The success of both albums saw U2 become easily the biggest touring band in the world. By 2011, the U2 360 tour was the highest grossing in history. The tour also promoted the album No Line on the Horizon.
The future needs a big kiss, winds blow with a twist. Never seen a moon like this, can you see it too?
It was produced once again by Eno, Lanois and Lillywhite, but the band had initially begun sessions for the album with producer Rick Rubin.
You could see that happening, but they're not there yet. They're not old enough. I think that they're still essentially a huge band. I could imagine Rick Rubin coming in and doing some kind of reinvention on them, but I don't think it's time yet. And I think actually they did the right thing by going back to Eno.
But you hear the material that did come out, the cover of the Skids, for example, and do you think actually it wasn't that different to U2? However, a whole album with Rick Rubin, on Rick Rubin's terms, with U2 acquiescing to him bringing out their strengths as songwriters. Oh, I just love to hear it.
Is it getting better? Or do you feel the same? Will it make it easier on you now?
I think U2 have had a huge influence on music. I think they've inspired bands to think big in terms of their shows.
One love, one life.
Now when people talk about bands getting big, they say, whereas they used to say we want to be as big as Led Zeppelin, we want to be as big as the Beatles, now they say we want to be as big as U2.
People have tried to imitate them, but I think their influence has been maligned, not through their fault, but because no one has done this stuff as good as they have. Because you can't imitate the chemistry that these four people have. You can't reproduce the doubts and the hubris that they have.
Or leave a bad taste in your mouth. You act like you never had love. You want me to go without.